You see, okay, we're expecting 400 participants, so we're not going to wait for all of them to get on, and we'll begin. So thank you all. Good. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and to those of you who are still the middle of the night, our apologies. Honorable panelists, participants, and guests on Facebook Live. COVID-19. Anybody say something? Good. Okay. COVID-19 has profoundly different effects on women and men across every sphere, from health, economy, and security to social protection. The impacts are worse for women and girls simply by virtue of their sex. Yet, the virus, why is that? The virus does not differentiate, yet we see the pandemic exacerbates inequalities. We have an amazing opportunity in the next 2 days to be enlightened by world leaders who will help us understand why and what our next steps should be. We thank you all for taking this journey together with us in an attempt to build gender equality into the pandemic recovery. My name is Chava Kari. I'm the director of the MASHAV Carmel Training Center. I'll be moderating with Sarah Wilner, deputy director with the beautiful red lipstick over there. And now I'd like to ask our host, Ambassador Gil Haskell, the head of MASHAV, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation, and Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to please open the conference. Gil, please.
Thank you very much, Chava, and shalom to all of you from Jerusalem. Just one correction, I'm not the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for the promotion, that was rather easy. So hello from Jerusalem. As the head of MASHAV, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation, I've had the chance to open numerous conferences and international events. But this is by far the most unusual and unconventional format yet. It's true that as we dig in deeper into the COVID-19 era, such conferences are turning into the new normal. But nevertheless, we will always miss our physical contact and the unique energy of bringing into one hall at the MCTC, the MASHAV Carmel International Training Center in the beautiful coastal city of Haifa, representatives from all over the globe for MASHAV's traditional international conference for women leaders that has been taking place for the last 32 years, every second year. I truly hope that this e-conference is a first and a last. This year's conference will analyze the socio-economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls and provide a platform for leading figures from all over the world to discuss its impact. The State of Israel, through MASHAV, has been focusing for the last 6 decades on assisting vulnerable communities throughout the developing world in over 140 countries in addressing day-to-day human development challenges through techniques, technologies, and best practices that have been proven effective in Israel's rapid development experience. In the constant attempt of leaving no one behind, we know that the chain of development in each country and in each community is as strong as its weakest link and its weakest social subgroup. In too many cases, these vulnerable subgroups consist of women and girls, and this has very much been amplified during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is exactly the topic of our conference, which I proudly declare open. I'd like to thank, on behalf of MASHAV, MCTC, and the government of the State of Israel, all the hundreds of participants that have registered to our conference, and especially to all our senior panelists who have taken time off their heavy duties and highly heavy schedules in these trying times and agreed to share with all of us their perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. I know Chava will thank all the organizers and partners from MCTC and from MASHAV of this conference, but I would like to take a minute and thank the MASHAV Carmel Golda Meir International Training Center, the MCTC, for organizing and hosting all of us today. The MCTC is the first of its kind center in the international domain of women empowerment. The main goal of this center is to enhance women and men's skills in order to contribute to the development process of their countries and communities. MCTC conducts physical and online training activities and high-level conferences both in Israel and overseas to advance women's participation in public life. Along the years, MCTC has focused on 3 areas of study: women's leadership and empowerment, innovation and entrepreneurship, and early childhood education and development, all in the line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To date, over 23,000 women and men from over 147 countries have benefited from hundreds of training activities and conferences. Our conference today is yet another one of those important platforms for exchanging ideas and perspectives. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish all of you interesting interactions and deliberations. Shalom.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Escal, for those important and inspiring words. When we spoke about holding the conference in January, we didn't speak about Zoom. We spoke about which hotel and the accommodations and how much champagne we would drink in the evening. But I think we have a new format and a new lives, and we'll make the best of it. So thank you very much. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank your team at MASHAV, Ambassador Savion Wadagorin, Shuli Korzon Van Gelder, Liad Baron, the staff of the Igud, as well as the amazing staff at MCTC, my colleagues at the MASHAV Carmel Training Center in Haifa, Sarah Wilner, Nuria Levi, Anna Andrachnik, Katrina Rodenko, and Yuda Michael. We do have one man on our team, so we are very inclusive. All of who have made this conference possible. We would now like, before we hear from Amina Mohammed and our guest of honor, Madam Fore, we would like to show a very short clip to introduce the conference.
MASHAV is Israel's International Development Cooperation Agency and international aid agency. MASHAV was established by the Foreign Minister and then Prime Minister Golda Meir. And MASHAV, in its 63 years of history, has trained scores of trainees from all over the world.
We believe that together, women of the world can make a difference.
It's quite evident that COVID-19 has amplified social inequalities, specifically towards women and girls. And this will be a fascinating opportunity to discuss this impact in this e-conference conducted by MASHAV and by MCTC.
Women's endemic economic disadvantage is exacerbated in times of economic crisis. The fact that women have a disparate level of care responsibilities more severely in a situation where people have been deprived of social services, and domestic violence has been enormously exacerbated by the lockdown. The last thing is government policy has to be gender sensitive.
We will hear from prominent world leaders how today they are using these challenges and making productive, innovative ideas in order to make changes in the world.
MASHAV decided to concentrate its activities in 2 parallel streams. One is humanitarian assistance to communities in need all over the developing world. And the other, we have been training trainees from well over 150 different countries through electronic and virtual platforms to keep the connection between MASHAV and trainees from all around the world.
We have to fight for social solidarity as women and for women, as well as for men, families and communities.
We hope that this e-conference will be as effective as the conferences we usually have here. We hope to greet you here next year in Israel.
I want to thank MCTC for organizing this very important e-conference and to thank all the participants that will take time out of their very busy schedules and come together and discuss how to make our world a better world, even though we're under a COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much to all that worked on the film. Have a chance to see our center, and we hope to have you here next time we have a conference, and invite you all to Haifa, Jerusalem, and to be with us here. We have the privilege to hear a message from Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. She has recorded a message to open the day's proceedings.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear friends, I'm delighted to join you today to celebrate women who are leading the response to COVID-19. The pandemic has caused an unprecedented and unrelenting health, humanitarian, and economic crisis. It is straining health and care systems, widening socio-economic divides, and creating deep political and social insecurity. The pandemic is exposing and exacerbating deep inequalities in our societies, including gender equality. Gender-based violence is increasing at home and online. Access to sexual and reproductive health services is being compromised as healthcare resources are redirected. Women disproportionately work in insecure, lower paid, part-time, and informal employment, the areas that are hardest hit by job losses due to the pandemic. And women have less access to social protection and health insurance to mitigate loss of income. Women's unpaid care burden is rising, and millions of girls are out of school with the risk that many may not return. The Sustainable Development Goals, our shared global agenda, provide the clearest path to address these injustices and inequalities, as well as a blueprint for recovery from the current crisis. Globally, women leaders and economists have been calling for greater shared responsibility and solidarity amongst all countries and across all sectors in the fight against the pandemic. They call for people to put at the center of external finance, debt, and international trade so that countries can build back better in a way that is sustainable and inclusive for all. Women have also been on the front lines of the response as health and care workers and community leaders providing essential services for the marginalized and isolated who are often left behind. Women's groups and civil society organizations are advocating and informing people, including the most vulnerable. Women leaders have won widespread praise for their compassion and decisiveness. They are showing how women's leadership and participation brings more effective, inclusive, and fair policies, plans, and budgets. But these women are still less than 10% of heads of state and government. Women are a minority on COVID-19 task forces and as decision makers steering the response to this crisis. We must build on the momentum and visibility of women leaders at this moment to push for lasting change, including through quotas and special measures. Greater gender balance and representation is crucial, not only to the recovery of COVID-19, but to rebuilding safer and more inclusive and sustainable societies and economies that enjoy the trust of all our citizens. Fiscal stimulus packages to respond to COVID-19, which already amount to at least $8 trillion, must support women's employment and include measures to counter gender discrimination and to increase women's access to social protection. The United Nations is leading efforts to achieve gender equality, safeguard the progress that has been made, and push for transformative change. The Secretary General issued an urgent appeal for peace in the home and an end to gender-based violence in early April. United Nations agencies are working with member states to ensure that national plans are there to respond to the pandemic, include measures to prevent and respond to domestic violence, and involve women in their assessments and response. We're also shifting resources to civil society organizations on the front line, especially those working with the most marginalized communities, persons with disabilities, refugees, and internally displaced. We're implementing strategies to achieve gender parity and to ensure our staff reflect the diversity of cultures in the world and include people with disabilities. This helps us to better understand the situations we work in, as well as find better solutions for the people we serve. We are working with governments on stimulus packages that work for women as well as men, and speaking up for women's rights to vital sexual and reproductive health services, even during a conflict or crisis. The strive for equality in economic and social and cultural rights applies to all contexts and situations, including conflicts and crises. Moreover, meeting the needs of the present population without compromising the needs of future generations is at the heart of sustainable development, and there can be no equality for women while they lack physical protection and the fundamental freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly. We've been encouraged by the cooperation between Israel and the State of Palestine regarding the urgent health response to the pandemic, and we very much hope for the same on the socio-economic impact and for international law to be respected at all times. Across the globe, as women leaders, we are taking action to overcome the pandemic and build back better. Our aim is to build societies and economies that are resilient to shocks, that can address the climate crisis, and that are fair to women and men. Because together, women rise for all. Women lead for all. Thank you.
Unmute. Thank you very much. Before Executive Director Fore begins opening the first panel, I would like to ask Sarah to explain a few logistics of the e-conference. Sarah, please.
Thank you, Chava. Thank you, everyone. Very exciting to be here today, and thank you all for joining us. We are being streamed live on Facebook through our MCTC Facebook page and the MASHAV page, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel Facebook page, which has over 500,000 followers. So we have people from all over the world who is watching right now, and I guess this is one of the pluses of doing it on Zoom and online. We're very excited about that. A few logistics: your microphones have been muted. You have control over the mute button, but please make sure to keep them on mute so that we can minimize all of the background noise while the panelists are speaking. The chat at the bottom of your screen is open, and we'd be happy to hear your comments and your questions on the chat. So please feel free to ask questions, and we will try to get to as many as possible, time permitting, at the end of the panel. That's it for me now. Thanks, Chava.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like now to welcome our first speaker, panel one, Executive Director of UNICEF, Henrietta Fore. Henrietta H. Fore became UNICEF's 7th Executive Director on the 1st of January, 2018. She has worked to champion economic development, education, health, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief in the public service, private sector, and nonprofit leadership career that spans for over 4 decades. From 2007 to 2009, Ms. Fore served as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and Director of United States Foreign Assistance. As the first woman to serve in these roles, she was responsible for managing $39.5 billion as U.S. foreign assistance annually. In 2009, she received the Distinguished Service Award, the highest award the Secretary of State can bestow. Thank you very much for being with us at such an early hour. We thought we were waking you up at 8 a.m. and now we learned that you're in California and we woke you up at 5 a.m. So Apologies. Please, you now have the microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hava. It is such a delight to be with you and Ambassador Haskell that it really doesn't matter what time it is. This is such an important idea and conference and gathering. And maybe next year, it could be a hybrid so that we can come in person and we can also come electronically. Anyway, we are delighted to be here. And we're very excited about working with all of our Israeli partners in health and in early childhood development. And we're excited to coming out of this conference, doing more work about scaling up some of the solutions that we hear about and that we want to do together for young women and children. So let's think forward after the conference, how we can be doing more work together. But I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I would also like to mention to my sister panelists today, thank you very much for gathering around the issues of girls and women who are now living under the shadow of COVID-19. The pandemic and its unprecedented measures to contain it do pose immediate and long-term risks to both girls and women, and they reveal once again that the world is not an equal place for all members of its society. Lockdowns, closed schools, restricted movements, job losses, economic hardship, and uncertainty. These challenges are affecting women and girls in an outsized way. For example, the pandemic is closing off access to vital health services like maternal care and vaccinations for their newborns. But these immediate health threats are matched by a range of other risks with long-term consequences. Risks to their education and protection, their access to economic opportunities, and ultimately their ability to contribute to their country's economic recovery. These risks are not new. Even before the crisis, girls were at a heightened risk of dropping out of school, of child marriage, teenage pregnancy, and violence. But lockdowns and service disruptions are making a bad situation even worse. UNICEF's partners are reporting rising levels of violence as girls and women are locked indoors with their abusers, and as crisis and counseling services are shut down. And some estimates indicate that over 1.3 million more child marriages will take place over the next decade due to economic hardships and program disruptions. But today I would like to focus on one area in particular, education and skills. Without them, how can girls and young women create better, safer, more prosperous futures for themselves? Even before the crisis struck, we were faced with a global learning and skills crisis, with 1 in 5 school-aged children out of school, with an estimated 617 million unable to read or perform basic math, even though 2/3 of them are actually in school. With more than half of all children in low and middle income countries unable to read by the age of 10. And with 87% of children in sub-Saharan Africa being unable to read or understand a simple story by the end of primary school. For girls and women, the crisis is especially acute. A new report finds that while the number of out-of-school girls has dropped by 79 million over the last 2 decades, 125 million are still not getting an education because they're poor, because they live in fragile or humanitarian settings, or because their parents keep them at home to do housework or to fetch water while their brothers learn. At the same time, adolescent girls were not getting equal access to skills and training, including transferable, digital, and entrepreneurial skills, and mentoring and job shadowing programs, all the tools and hands-on training that every person needs to build a career. In fact, nearly 1 in 4 girls aged 15 to 19 is neither employed nor in education or training, compared to 1 in 10 boys of the same age. Now under COVID-19, the situation is growing far worse. As we've seen from other pandemics like Ebola, the longer girls are out of school, the less likely they are to return. The young women will face a shrinking job market as economic losses pile up and businesses downsize or close. Without action, a new World Bank report found that about 7 million students could drop out due to the economic shock of the pandemic alone, and a school shutdown of just 5 months could generate learning losses valued at $10 trillion. As countries recover, they'll need all the economic firepower they can get, including from girls. Economies cannot afford to lose out on these ideas, innovations, entrepreneurial spirit, and dedication of 1/2 of humanity. So at UNICEF, we're using this moment to reimagine education and skills development for the future, especially for girls and young women. We need to build new systems and leverage new technologies to deliver education and skills in new ways. We want to scale up digital solutions and greater connectivity to reach every child. The goal is to have 500 million children and young people engaged in digital learning by the end of 2021, and 3.5 billion children and young people by 2030. To do this, we want to connect every school in the world to the internet. We're scaling up world-class digital tools so that children and young people can gain a quality education no matter where they live. For example, we've joined forces with Microsoft and Cambridge University on what we call the Learning Passport. It's an online platform that gives children and youth access to their school curriculum online, wherever they are, including textbooks and instructions in their national language. And as we address the geographical digital divide, we must also address the gender digital divide. So we're focusing on digital literacy to prepare adolescent girls and young women for the world of work. In Tajikistan, for example, only 20% of the rural girls use the internet. So we're working with the government on a pilot program called Tech for Girls to train them to perform a range of tasks, from simple copying and pasting documents to running specific software. And in Lebanon, we're working with the ILO on a program to help young people gain access to marketable skills, including digital skills. Of the 69,000 young people who have participated, over 62% are girls. We are also helping our work for the realities of COVID-19 to adjust. So in India, for example, we're working with partners to provide online career sessions and skills development via YouTube. We need to scale up these digital and remote learning opportunities. We need to bring together public, private, and philanthropic partners to do it. And this month, UNICEF joined forces with Gender Smart and Volta Capital to release a new guide for investors to help us finance local solutions that can deliver skills and training to a new generation of young women. We want investors to follow the lead of others who have successfully started up programs in this area. For example, thanks to this kind of partnership approach to financing and delivery, the Moringa School in Kenya and Rwanda have developed tailored curricula for young people, predominantly young women. They're learning modern skills for modern work, like software development and data science. In just 5 years, they've achieved a 90% job placement rate for tomorrow's tech leaders. The potential is enormous. There are currently more than US $21 billion in existing impact investments that could be directed to helping a generation of girls and young women transition from school to work in emerging markets. We need to work together to tap into these investments and direct them to rebuilding education and skills delivery systems for every child and young person, and especially for girls and women. Help us reimagine better education for all children. Help us gather more partners and investors around the need to improve access to online tools for learning and skills, especially for girls at every stage of their learning and development. And finally, let's give girls every opportunity to lend their hands to shaping a lasting and sustainable economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your stimulating and engaging talk. I'd like to hear you once speaking at 8 o'clock. I don't know what more you could say, but this is really fantastic. And thank you so much for being with us this morning, early morning. We know that despite all the global challenges today, UNICEF is committed to deliver services and continue scaling up operations, as you mentioned, to reach millions of children with life-saving and new interventions needed. It's amazing to hear about all the new programs you have started, even in these difficult days. We would like, if you agree and you have a few more minutes, we would like to see if there are a few questions that we can take from the audience. Would that be all right?
Yes, of course. I'll stay with you.
Okay, great. Sarah, can I ask you to read a few questions from the chat for
Sure.
the Executive Director? Yes, please.
We have a question from the chat asking specifically about refugee camps. So how would we ensure that girls from refugee camps are catered to, bearing in mind that COVID-19 has already escalated their vulnerability status?
So this is a really important area. There are so many girls who are exceedingly vulnerable in these camps. And as you know, for many of the camps, there is no physical distancing space. So they are crowded in one tent or one room, and there can be 8, 10, 12 refugees who are all together. So the health issues during COVID are extremely difficult. But so is the violence at home, both physical and sexual. So we've got to try to help girls and young women at this time. And in the camps, it's exceedingly important. So one of the programs that I mentioned, the Learning Passport, was developed just for these girls. It was set up for refugees so that they could continue their learning while they were in a camp. So you can learn in your own language, and you can download your national education plan, and you can be following along on it so that you can complete your training and your education while you are still out of the country and you are in a camp. This is a tool now that can change a young woman's life. So we are hoping that we can place this in refugee camps all over the world. But it's a brand new tool. It's really important. It's one for scaling up.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and we have a question here from Rachel Gershoni, who's asking, while it is important to gear young people to economically viable jobs, what place are you giving to future philosopher historians who are every bit as necessary to the welfare of the world?
So I certainly relate to this question since I graduated in history. And I love the idea that we need liberal arts education for our young people. The learning crisis has taught us that there are several stages in life that are exceedingly important if you're going to develop historians and scientists and poets. One is that by the age of 5, that you are ready for learning. So that means that early childhood development, early nutrition in the first 1,000 days of life, and vaccinations so that you prevent early childhood diseases, they're all very important. So be ready to learn by the age of 5. Then by the age of 10, that you should be able to read and comprehend a paragraph and a simple story. That's a very important moment in life. And it's, for many young people, it's the cross between a primary school and the beginning of a lower secondary school. And then the third point that's very important is by the age of 18, you should have learned some skills that can give you a livelihood so that you don't worry about what might lie ahead. In our recent data, we are seeing that 8 out of 10 young people who are in the poorest countries are going to have to be entrepreneurs. There aren't going to be jobs that many of us have enjoyed. We need 10 million new jobs a month in our world, and we're not creating them. So these young people need to have a livelihood by the time they're 18 that they can pursue to make their own way in the world and to create their own jobs. It's an exciting future for girls, but we have to teach them how to be good entrepreneurs.
Thank you. And one last question, because I see that there's many people in the chat asking the same type of question, which is, how are you coping with access to computers and the internet for poor families in developing countries and developed countries, and how can you address this? You know, how can you reach these communities that have poor access to the internet?
It's an enormous challenge. So we've gathered a group with the International Telecommunications Union, and it's called GIGA, or GAVI for gigabytes. What we are hoping to do is to use low Earth satellites and the providers who are doing the last mile, that we can gather this into common bids. So every school could be connected to the internet, and every government would want to connect their schools to the internet. We're doing mapping of schools now using artificial intelligence in country after country after country. So it's starting to roll out. And we are asking that companies who have the capacity for devices, that they would be willing to give or sell at a very good price devices that we can give to the children and to the teachers in these low and middle income countries. And then we've gathered a consortium around the idea that we will need electricity. We will need good online access to learning materials, software materials. So we do this with UNESCO and many of our partners, a big public-private partnership under Generation Unlimited, so that you can learn the skills that you need to make your way in this world. So it's a comprehensive approach. We have talked to the telecom companies, and many of them now are willing to give us 0 rating for downloading educational materials. So this means that if a young person wants to download their educational materials, there's no cost. And that's also important for teachers. It's important for low-income school districts. So we think all the pieces are coming together. We want to come out of COVID stronger. We now see the need in every country and every community for remote learning, whether it is online, by radio, by television. We just cannot let any young person, particularly the girls, miss out on schooling.
Thank you so much. I see that there are a few more other questions, and I think that we need to move on. Perhaps you can point our participants to where they can find more resources on the programs that you spoke about.
Yes, good. So unicef.org, we're the website, and Generation Unlimited, and you will see it there. You'll also see something on Giga. So please come join us and send word, email, calls, connect with us. We'd love to hear from everyone. So thank you very much. Have a great conference.
Thank you very, very much. We greatly appreciate. We really see we have 52 questions on the chat, but we'll let you go back to sleep. So thank you again for being with us today and sharing these wonderful insights. And it has been a great honor for us that you agreed to be the speaker at our conference. So again, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I would like to join the thank you, Henrietta. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gil.
Okay, so again, thank you. And we now go on to our next speaker, who is Executive Secretary of UNECE. 2 years ago, she was with us at the conference here in Haifa, and this year we will suffice to be on Zoom together. Olga Algayerova, coming to us from Geneva, I think. I don't know, everybody I thought was coming from New York is coming from somewhere else, so I assume you're at Geneva. On the 13th of April, 2017, the Secretary General appointed Ms. Algayerova of Slovakia as the next Executive Secretary of UNECE. She brings to the position a combination of leadership and diplomatic skills with a deep knowledge of the region, with its challenges and opportunities, and a strong focus on building and nurturing partnerships among key stakeholders and within the United Nations. Prior to her appointment, she served as permanent representative of Slovakia to the international organizations in Vienna. She was previously President, Slovak Millennium Development Goals, and State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, Madam Executive Secretary, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, dear Hava. It's so nice to see you after a long time. Distinguished Ambassador Haskell, dear Jill, dear Henrietta, dear Asa, dear Professor Raday, dear colleagues, friends, dear international women leaders. It's my really pleasure to be with you today. When Henrietta mentioned that maybe next year we meet in hybrid meeting, I really was thinking, I was there in person 2 years ago and I would like to come next year in person. So, but again, it's my great honor to speak to this conference on social economic impact of COVID-19 on women and girls today, because UNECE is really doing a lot on economic and social impact on COVID. As the world is battling the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences, I'm proud to be a part of this amazing team of women leaders and express solidarity and commitment to act in partnerships with all of you to tackle this multifaceted impact of this crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has spread worldwide and is affecting all areas of our life in an unprecedented way, from changing the way we work, study, communicate, to functioning in our everyday life. The format of our meeting today is again one example. We all witness that the COVID-19 crisis affects everyone, but women and girls face specific and often disproportionate economic, health, and social risks, from an increased burden of unpaid care work to worsening rates of gender-based violence. Let me share with you some evidence on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and girls from our region. First, women are on the front line of the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. Women make up the majority of workers in the healthcare sector, exceeding 75% for the UNECE region, and have been under enormous pressure. At the same time, care professionals are also among the most underpaid jobs. Women dominate as employees in the so-called system-relevant sectors such as supermarkets, pharmacies, and women are over 82% of all cashiers in our region. And we can see this all has exposed them to a higher risk of infection compared to men. Unpaid care and domestic work of women has substantially increased. All women know that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused enormous challenges. Some women losing their jobs, other juggling home office and increased demand for childcare and home education of their children, domestic work during lockdown. In average, 13 hours per week that women spend more than men on unpaid care work in our region before the pandemic has gone up with the closure of schools and childcare centers. And of course, region is big, so situation and trends differ between sub-regions and countries. The share of women's unpaid work in total work is around 60% just in Northern Europe, against 65% in the Western Europe and 70% in Southern Europe, whereas men is about 40% in Northern Europe and in Western Europe, except in the Netherlands, and below 40% in Southern Europe. And these are substantial additional burdens for childcare for families with young children. In some Western European countries, it's estimated an additional 49 hours per week, 60% of which falls to women. And then we have decline in financial security. To sharp reduction of employment opportunities has hit women's financial security. Women in precarious employment are most vulnerable to the economic downturn, which started with the health crisis. Over a quarter of women employees in our region are in precarious jobs, as compared to about 15% for men. These jobs provide lower earnings and weaker legal protection. Reduction of the part-time jobs and other labor market opportunities, in particular in the service sector such as food, hospitality and tourism, where women are predominantly employed, has resulted in a significant drop in earnings and increase in poverty. Then remittances, another topic. Support from remittances has sharply diminished in our region. Many single female-headed households in the Western Balkans, Central Asia, Caucasus, that have relied largely on remittances in the past few years are hit strongly by the contraction of economic activity in the host countries, job losses, and mobility restrictions. And so the risk of poverty for these women and their children has drastically increased. Last but not least, we have violence against women and girls that has increased. In some countries with over 30%. Under strict lockdown measures, women were trapped in their homes and they also had nowhere to go with shelters being closed. And these developments, ladies and gentlemen, threaten not only to stall, but to undermine decades of progress towards gender equality and empowerment of women. We know 2020 should have been a groundbreaking year for gender equality, when we were marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, the most progressive and comprehensive agenda for gender equality. And instead, we now have to make sure that the limited and hard-won gains on gender equality and women's rights will not be reversed. So, in conclusion, what can we do to meet our commitments to gender equality in the post-COVID-19 period? How is UNECE contributing to stop these negative trends of rising gender inequalities? From the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have joined forces with all our partners in the UN system at the global, regional level, country level, in providing support to our member states as a response to this health and humanitarian crisis in different various socio-economic areas. More specifically, work was centered around the implementation of the UN framework for the immediate socio-economic response to COVID-19, which operationalizes the UN Secretary General's report, Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity, Responding to Social Economic Impact of COVID-19. We have also worked together with UN Women and other UN agencies on integrating gender considerations into the COVID-19 responses at the country level to ensure that the voices of women and girls are included and that their needs are met both in the immediate responses as well as in the plans for recovery. Transparent and inclusive cooperation is the only way to lead us through the COVID-19 crisis and its social and economic consequences. So now let me turn to two examples where such a partnership is ongoing and my organization takes an active role in the related activities. My first example is in the priority area of building resilience to the pandemic in our member states through social economic policies with a gender lens. In June this year, in cooperation with our sister regional commissions, we started a project to strengthen national capacities for assisting rapid recovery from COVID-19 and building resilience against future shocks. This includes a strong focus on gender-responsive economic and social policies to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the care economy, where the unpaid care and domestic work of women is concentrated. The regional assessment will provide a detailed analysis of the existing governmental responses and identify key challenges that our countries face in designing and implementing gender-sensitive policies in this area. My second example relates to women's and girls' participation in all forms and levels of the COVID-19 response through already discussed access to technology, like internet with its various platforms, mobile phones, etc. To equip women entrepreneurs with updated knowledge and skills on the use of ICTs, we regularly organize together with MASHAV and Golda Meir Mount Carmel International Training Center international workshops. This year, in our workshop, which took place in June and beginning of July, we have focused on the use of ICTs with a gender lens for the needs of the small businesses, which combines the gender mainstreaming approach with the technological tools. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank MASHAV and its director, Madam Hava Curry, and all team for the long-standing fruitful cooperation on gender activities in the areas of information sharing and capacity building for professional women from Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and Central Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to put a gender lens to all areas of our work, and in cooperation with our partners in the UN system, civil society and the private sector, advocate for a sustainable recovery that is closely connected with the empowerment of women and the achievement of gender equality in all spheres. Together, we must use the COVID-19 crisis to accelerate this change, expand the opportunities for women and girls to be part of the solution, to set up a new normal mode of working and living, and by that shape the future of the planet for the benefit of all. I am deeply convinced that today's and tomorrow's exchange of experiences, strategies, and tools to find solutions and mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls across the globe will be a valuable contribution to turn the eye on the many challenges we are facing today. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to stay with you.
Thank you very, very much, Olga, and for your engrossing remarks. We know that UNECE, under your direction, set up recommendations, standards, tools, and resources to address the long-term challenges faced today. Forming partnerships, as you say, is imperative, and we hope that today's conference and all the work that we do together with UNECE will assist in this initiative. We thank you very much for the years of participation together with us. Gil Haskel is still the head of MASHAV, so thanks for the upgrade. We do hope to greet you in Israel in the near future. And thank you so much for being with us. We know you're on Zoom 24/7, and we took a little piece of your day, so we really do appreciate it. It's very kind of you, and thank you for your remarks. Very important, and I'm sure people will relate to them throughout the conference. Thank you. Thank you very, very much for being with us. Much appreciated. So we will now go.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Gil. Thank you, Olga. We will now go to our next panelist coming from Sweden. Again, we thought we were waking up in New York, and she is just arrived to Sweden. Deputy Executive Director of the UN Women, Åsa Regnér. Ms. Åsa Regnér serves as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women since May 2018. Ms. Regnér served since 2014 as Minister for Children, the Elderly, and Gender Equality in Sweden, where her focus was on concrete results in the implementation of Swedish gender equality policies, as well as a shift towards prevention of violence against women and the involvement of men and boys in gender equality. She has extensive experience in the area of gender equality and women's empowerment, having held various leadership positions in government, non-governmental organizations, and the United Nations. She has led important processes and campaigns as a leading advocate for feminism and gender equality in Sweden and beyond. Assistant Secretary General, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Can you hear and see me well? Good. So thank you to all participants. I see there many of you are very active, and I want to thank, of course, the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Mohammed, Henrietta, and Olga for the sisterhood with all of you, and most of all today, of course, colleagues at MASHAV for organizing this and for having UN Women among the panelists. And Olga just spoke before me, and we met actually in person. The last time we did so was to prepare the celebrations of the Beijing platform and its 25th anniversary, where we were taking stock in Olga's region that she told us about. And first of all, thank you for your passion for these issues, Olga. It's very much needed, not least now. But as you pointed out, we already saw that we had come quite a bit on the way since 1995, but also that we would have had a lot to do had the COVID crisis not hit the world. So we really have to take this knowledge into account and work from there. And I think that reality just shows us that we can't just repeat what we did, because it's not working. It's not working for girls, it's not working for women, or also not for men and boys, and definitely not for gender equality and societies. So from UN Women's side, we will definitely celebrate Beijing Plus 25, although it might be mostly and we hope physically in 2021, but we are building on this knowledge and we are using it to support women and girls to come out of the COVID crisis. We hope stronger than before, and we all need well, everybody's support in that work. So I think also, as my sisters on the panel already pointed out, we see that women live in a contradiction right now. On the one hand, it is literally women who save the lives of the rest of us. They work in healthcare, they work in elderly care, they work in food production, in food security, agriculture, pharmacies, cleaning, sanitations, all these services that we literally need to stay alive right now. On the other hand, these jobs are undervalued, underpaid, sometimes not paid at all, because that was the old logic. These jobs were seen as important perhaps, but still complementary. And the thinking was that there would be some kind of other income in a household where the woman was dedicating her time to this, paid or unpaid. And that thinking just has to change. And I think it's a very important task for all of us to make that the unsustainability of that thinking and those societies visible to the rest of us. From UN Women's side, we are still going through what we know about the economic stimulus packages or the answer, so to speak, from UN member states to the crisis financially. And at least 152 countries and territories have put in place fiscal responses to the COVID-19. And as far as I remember, the Deputy Secretary General mentioned that this is roughly around 10 trillion US dollars so far. Our initial review of these packages indicates, unfortunately, that although the reality is, as we have all described, very few of these packages were actually designed with a thorough gender lens, and also very few even contained measures to support women and girls specifically, or to change the inequalities in the specific countries. So we have to do something about that, and I will come back to some proposals that we have. The latest ILO estimates indicate a loss of 400 million jobs worldwide in total for women and men. So we see that the deterioration of the situation is there as we speak, and that's why we have to do all of this right now, and the recovery cannot be returned to business as usual. And the pandemic has also pointed to deepening existing inequalities in many ways. And we know also, again, as a background from the Ebola crisis, that it took longer for women's economic situation to recover than it did for men's economic situation to recover, for instance, in West Africa. So many, as I said before, although many of the jobs and the work that women do is highly needed in society today, very many of them have been organized in the informal sector and economy in a large number of countries in the world. They have been hard hit, and the women have been hard hit because they're not covered necessarily by health insurances, by social security, by employment benefits, unemployment benefits, etc. And this we see from UN Women's daily work when I speak to my representatives in the different countries where we work, more than 40 countries where we have offices and another 40 countries where we have programs, that these little incomes that women used to have, they were also sometimes so small that they were not taken seriously necessarily. They were kind of not taken into account. But now that many of them have gone lost, that was actually like the last resource or resort that many communities had. And we see around the world that not only are women getting poorer and more dependent on men, sometimes bad men, but it's also devastating, obviously, for children. And hunger gets into these communities because these particular incomes are lost as well. And it also makes both individual women and sometimes whole communities, for instance, more dependent on bad offers of service, for instance, from armed groups or terrorists. And we also see that women, especially in conflict zones, suffer even more during these circumstances from the loss of incomes. My fellow panelists also mentioned the fact that we have a shadow pandemic right now, which is the violence against women. And obviously this violence doesn't just appear all of a sudden. It's not like the kitchen cabinets which are hitting women. It is actually men who are in confinement with women. It's men who were violent before, but the difference now is that the exposure time, so to speak, for women is much higher, and they can't get out many times, they can't seek help. And there are also triggering factors for the already violent men sometimes. When it comes to loss of income, perhaps in unemployment, more alcohol or whatever it is. But I want to repeat that it's really the violent behavior of men that is the problem. And we do see that a lot of countries respond to this in some way through provisions, which is good, like helplines, shelters, etc. But they are very ad hoc organized, and they are not financed in a way that truly can prevent and change this reality. All of this just also, it's a short-term problem, but it also, we all have the task to fulfill the promises of the 2030 agenda and to further implement the Beijing platform, for instance. So what we have been doing from UN Women's side, well, we work with this all the time, every day in the countries where we are. I have made sure to stay in close contact with the representatives we have in the countries to understand women's reality. And what we have been doing specifically on the topic of economic downturn and women's situation is that we have used time to really see, to understand more how governments respond to women's needs. And we have also, together with UNDP, designed a tool called the Gender Response Tracker, where we can assess more than 1,500 measures to see whether they are gender sensitive or not. So we are calling on governments with that information to adopt the following short-term measures, and I will conclude with this. We would like them, one, to adopt economic relief and recovery measures that are developed in consultation with women and their organizations. And unfortunately, we see that women's organizations suffer even more than before from shrinking political space and lack of finances. Secondly, we want to ensure expanded social protection, as I mentioned before. And we have different examples of that in different parts of the world. It can be cash transfers, or it can be solid social protection schemes. Thirdly, we want governments to support hard-hit sectors that employ a large-scale share of women. And we see that also this is happening in some countries. And fourthly, we call for governments to support women-led enterprises, and we have seen examples of that, for instance, in some African states. We think it's very important to always have sex disaggregated data to increase the targeting of measures and to see to it that women actually get their fair share of whatever measures are put into place. And our sixth recommendation to countries is to, of course, prevent and redress violence against women as an important part of government's national response. Shelters, helplines, judicial systems which continue to work, obviously with the goal to fight impunity, to integrate gendered approaches to social protection schemes, and also to see to it that any kind of reply or response to the violence situation is at the heart of COVID responses plans, and to see to it that men's role in this is addressed, and also the last point under women's rights in these packages would be also to make sure that sexual reproductive health and rights are safeguarded during the pandemic. So all of this is very important for us, and we want to encourage governments to see to it that gender equality, women's rights, and all of these needs are in the center of economic stimulus packages, both for women's and girls' rights, but most of all for the survival of whole societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for this comprehensive and enthralling speech. I think we all learned a lot. And when we'll put the puzzle together with all the, from all the panelists, I think we'll have a wealth of information. It's wonderful to hear about the cooperation between UN and other organizations for the benefit of women and girls. We know that UN Women works intensively to support women and girls' rights, and even more so during this time of crisis. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. It's afternoon, and please stay on with us till the end of the panel. You, Olga, and our next speaker, the questions will come at the end. So if you'll please stay on. I see we have 77 questions. We won't give you all of them, but well, Sarah has the difficult task to choose a few. So please stay with us. Thank you again. We now move on to Jerusalem for our final panelist for this session, Professor Frances Raday. Professor Raday was born in England and completed her bachelor's degree in law at the London School of Economics. In 1968, she immigrated to Israel, completing her doctorate of law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Raday has written numerous books and articles on the subject of human rights, labor law, religion, and feminist theory. Professor Raday currently heads the Concord Institute for the Study of Absorption of International Law in Israel. As part of her public activities, Professor Raday serves as chairperson of the working group of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, examining discrimination against women. She formerly served as a member of the United Nations Committee to CEDAW. Professor Raday also serves as, there's so many things I have to make order, serves as chairperson of the Advisory Committee to the Commission for Equal Opportunities in Work, and served as the founding chairperson of the Legal Center of the Israel's Women's Network. She has represented numerous petitioners in groundbreaking Supreme Court cases concerning claims for rights in the fields of labor law, human rights, and discrimination. Thank you, Professor Raday, for being with us from beautiful Jerusalem, and we pass on the microphone to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me here. I did make a presentation because it's such a short time to address these very complex issues, but I have had the benefit of hearing Henrietta Fore and Olga Algayerova and Regnér, and some of the things I say, they have said already. So I'll try not to repeat too much, but I think that many of us are aware of the really severe and sometimes tragic problems that societies are facing, communities, families, and especially women in the COVID-19 era, the times of Corona. You asked me, Sarah, to indicate when I'm moving from one slide to the next. So I'm starting with the unequal economic starting point. And in fact, this has been addressed to some extent by all the speakers, that we're not talking about a totally new phenomenon of women's inequality, but I want to emphasize women's economic inequality, because I think we have not sufficiently emphasized that, particularly in the economic sphere, which is what is being so hard hit by COVID, women start from an equal economic starting point. There was revolutionary achievement of equality in the 20th century, and indeed Henrietta Fore talked about that in education, and Olga Algayerova talked about its equality achievements. We know there were enormous, theoretical in some ways, the right to equality, and in some cases the implementation of equality was in a very revolutionary way recognized in the 20th century. And this we heard also from Regnér, but she pointed out that while there was this progress in de jure entitlement to equality in education, in democratic representation, in labor force participation, entry to free professions, and access to resources, including credit and land. As a result of neoliberal inequality and more recently austerity policies, women have not achieved de facto equality. In fact, they have been subject to perhaps ever increasing de facto inequality. Neoliberalism has introduced very strong trends of inequality, and women have been on the losing end of that economic inequality. The World Economic Forum predicted that it will take 100 years at current rates, this is before COVID-19, to close the general gender gap, but it will take 217 years to close the economic gender gap. It is in their economic lives that women have really lagged behind equality achievements of the 20th century. And the third and fourth industrial revolutions prior to the COVID-19 crisis threatened women's jobs more than men's. The World Economic Forum predicted that women would lose 5 jobs for one gained, while men would lose only 3 jobs for one gained. It's also terrible, 3 jobs for one gained, but women would lose 5 jobs for one gained. The OECD did not reach the same conclusion for women in the OECD, because probably these are high income countries, and it might be that some of women's care jobs would not be affected in the same way as jobs in the developing world for women. I want to go on to the next slide. The economic threat of COVID-19 is an extremely gendered threat. I think the COVID-19 crisis, which echoes the 2008 financial crisis, it echoes it in a way which even more severely impacts women and girls than the 2008 crisis and the austerity policies that were introduced after the 2008 crisis affected them. Unemployment has increased more for women than for men, which was uncertain in the wake of the 2008 crisis. There were different stages as regards male and female unemployment, but at the moment it's quite clear that women's employment has been more severely affected than men. Unpaid childcare burdens, which are largely provided by women, we heard 60% provision by women, have been increased by closure of schools and kindergartens, contributing to their further loss of employment. Zoom learning has imposed burdens. We heard the benefits of Zoom learning from Henrietta Fore, but it has also imposed an additional burden, especially on women who take over more of the childcare functions. And for poorer women, it's been especially problematic because they do not have equal access to computers and internet. But even those women in developed countries who do have, I mean, we've had some very almost amusing and tragic video clips of mothers with 4 children trying to teach all 4 of them on the different Zoom sessions from their schools on one computer at the same time. So that's the women who are better off. The reduction of care service, the reduction of care services and social services, which happened also after the 2008 economic financial crisis, has been even greater because it's been compounded by lockdown. So even it's not just a question of cutting down resources and budgets, it's also cutting down physical access to services. And this, of course, is one of the things that has so badly affected access to reproductive health care, including contraceptives and abortion. Even where women have been entitled to these services by right, they haven't been able to access them. And we heard as well, especially from all 3 of the speakers, how domestic violence has increased as women and girls have been confined to home. Where there is a violent male, they have been trapped with the violent male, and it's been much harder to accept any kind of help. The jobs in the care sector, as we heard, have not only been underpaid as they were before, but have exposed women to risk. They've exposed women to health risk, And additionally, women who've have a double burden of care at home, and these women in the front line have had to go on doing their jobs in more tension, longer hours, under more stress, and still go on with a double burden of home and work. And in addition, many of the domestic workers, many of the migrant women, have been excluded from their workplaces because families have not wanted to have a domestic worker in the house under lockdown. So it's an extreme threat for women. To go on to the next slide. I talked about small and medium-sized enterprises, but I do want to include informal workers, and informal workers were mentioned again by both the last speakers, that it's informal workers and small and medium-sized enterprise. I meant to put them together because quite often they are meshed. Women entrepreneurs are concentrated in small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in consumer, culture, and social services, many of which were paralyzed by the lockdown. On the whole, and this is not true of every country, but it's true in many countries, including in Israel, small and medium-sized enterprises have received less government support, if they've received any at all. In Israel, they've received, really many of them have received no support at all, but they've received less support than large corporations, which governments tend to finance in order to prevent the collapse of the institutional investors, such as banks or pension funds. Small and medium-sized enterprises usually run on a cash flow basis, and they cannot survive a long period without income. In Israel, the owners, sorry, have you gone on to this slide? I'm not sure.
Israel también ha tenido que escribir.
I can hear somebody, is that somebody speaking? In Israel, the owners of businesses whose monthly income comes out of the cash flow, in other words, they pay themselves a salary, have not received unemployment benefits as informal workers. Women who are informal workers have also not received unemployment benefits in many countries, or in many countries, there's not been any alternative monthly subsistence program. So the situation, I think, is dire. I want to go on to the next slide. Gender policy solutions. Well, we heard, I think, from all the speakers that women's participation is absolutely essential. But it is essential, and yet we have to know that women's level of participation in economic decision-making is lower than in any other branch, maybe other than defense administration. They are at a very low level of participation at high levels of economic decision-making. They have only 3% of economic portfolios in governments. We heard that the world leaders, there are 10% of prime ministers. So they do, in a sense, have power over the economic portfolio, but of direct economic portfolios, women only hold 3% in governments, and they have less than 6% of CEO jobs in the corporate world. And we've seen that the role of women leaders has proved to be correlated with successful management of the corona crisis. So this deficit, this economic power deficit of women in determining economic policy is extremely problematic at the present stage. And those who say that we have to immediately change it and not go back to business as usual, I think are absolutely right. Well, on top of participation, women have to bring to the table gender sensitive policies. Men and women have to bring to the table gender sensitive policies. In the 2008 crisis, a few countries did introduce gender sensitive responses. Iceland is the outstanding example. With protection of public services and childcare entitlements, they put this high on the agenda of a government, of a woman prime minister and the economics minister, and a majority female government put the protection of public services, which includes public service jobs for women, incidentally, and childcare entitlements at the top of the agenda. and avoided cutting those things in an austerity program. And Iceland did succeed in repaying its debt on schedule. So it's possible to be done, and we have to look at this example. In times of corona, we need a job guarantee, decent work, including for domestic labor and care work, guaranteed basic income for all who are unable to work in the economic market, whether as employees or entrepreneurs, informal workers, or in the formal labor market. I'm just going to show a picture of the world leaders whom we can be rather proud of for actually being the ones who have done the best to balance flattening the curve and making sure that there wasn't total economic collapse. And we can see the 7 leaders, women leaders who have set this example, and this should give us hope. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much for this informative, enlightening, and passionate talk. Gil and I have had discussions whether the women leaders are those that are best or not, and I assume we will continue this discussion in the future, but I appreciate very much your comments, very helpful. We will hear from a representative of the OECD tomorrow, so you can certainly bring up your interesting comments again then. We would appreciate that.
I'll definitely be there.
Great. We will kindly ask you to take 2 minutes to wrap up after the question and answer period. Thank you. So we now move to the question and answer session where Sarah online will present some of the questions and comments to the panelists. I see we have many, many questions and comments, so maybe take 2 or 3, and so please, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chava. Yes, we have a very lively discussion happening on the chat here, and I think some permanent questions that are important to ask. You all spoke about including the voice of girls and women in the recuperation plans and in the decision making. And there has been a question about any suggestions on how to include more voices of women in these decision making roles, and also specifically about recuperating plans after COVID-19. So can we start perhaps with Olga? I know that you answered a few of those points on the chat, but maybe you can extend them.
Of course, Sarah. Thank you again for the question, and I try to respond as it was possible in writing. Of course, recovery plans are produced and implemented by governments. Of course, parliaments have some say if it is regarding legislation, and in each country we have civil society, we have academia who definitely deliver some work on it. We are all aware now, all these beautiful speeches, that really there is a lot of gender element in economic threat of impact of COVID-19, economic and social. So what international organizations and especially regional commissions, because I speak from my perspective, so we are typical intergovernmental body. When we provide a platform for governments to meet, we have 56 member states in our region, and as we are economic commission, so we really reacted in the very first weeks after pandemics started, the lockdown. And these 3 areas are more because we are very strong in transport to facilitate connectivity, because that time, you know, the borders were closed and the essential goods were not flowing through the border. So in some parts of our region, there was lack of the goods, essential goods like healthcare, food, and of course, I don't need to speak about the specific impact on women. And the prices of those essential goods started to rise. So we really first days were taking care about renew this connectivity, not to stop the flow of the goods and trade and trucks coming through the borders. And we all, again, can see how women were vulnerable in giving just the food to their families, to providing the healthcare for their families. If you don't have the basics, so how you can take care about your family. So then the second big area, how we respond to the crisis is, we call it to address transboundary and other risks. And we speak here namely about our multilateral environmental agreements, because what we do is we have our legal instruments, we produce our standards and norms that we push then the governments to implement, okay? And if I speak about multilateral environmental agreements, we have one of them, just to name as example, is the Water Convention. So access to water, that was essential because washing the hands, just only that, if I don't speak about cooking and other hygiene requirements. So access to water is one of the basics elements of our Water Convention, because this is what we are dealing with. Then the use of standards, we are producing gender-specific standards in different areas of industries. And of course, we not every day realize how the standards needs to be gender responsive, okay? A very small example, if men and women drive a car and you use the safety belts, nobody thinks about that, how the pregnant woman can use the safety belt, for instance, you know. Then we do a lot of work on statistics, because these aggregated statistical data are in the big need today, how to respond, how to take the right decisions in these pandemics, right? And then if you provide the gender disaggregated data, then the governments can make the right decisions. So, and here our commission does a great work. Directly, we are working with all 56 national statistical offices, with Eurostat, with everybody, just to provide the right data. And last but not least is green and resilient recovery, because we don't want to build back and to do the business as usual. We want to have a better recovery. We want to live better lives, and we all understand today that how people behave, people to be people, how we use the transport, how we take care about our families. We need to change something in our modus operandi so that we don't come back to that business as usual, because it led us to, so private sector participation. We can speak hours and hours about women's empowerment, you know. Then we have a big topic, cities, you know, because I saw in the chat somebody speaking about the rural areas, but in October, we organize a forum of mayors in our region, and we will speak about the COVID impact. And of course, one of the topics will be how women in these big cities, what impact it was on them, you know. And my favorite, circular economy. And, you know, here SMEs and women can do a lot on building back better and to increase. Do we understand that the circularity worldwide is just 11%? How do we use our natural resources? So we need to increase that level of circularity. And here I invite all women and women leaders to help me, because we will have in April next year our commission session, what is our highest political organ, giving us political direction of work for our next 2 years. And I want to bring the topic of circular economy here. And I will invite all governments how to increase circularity in our region. So I believe I don't want to bore you longer. Thank you, but I'm happy to answer any of your further questions.
Thank you so much. Asa or Francis, would you like to add something more to this question?
I think these are wonderful initiatives. I think women are still concentrated in advisory positions to their own
pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps in civil society organizations. UN Women has a position which is not just a civil society organization, but still it does not have implementary power. And we have a real problem in getting women into positions in which they can carry out economic programs. They can allocate budgets. And when I showed you the women leaders of the world, I wanted to say that maybe this is an opportunity, because there is a theory in corporate analysis that women are elected to leading positions in crisis situations for corporations. It's called the glass cliff. That they, when everything's going fine, they prefer very male-style leadership, the corporations. When things are in crisis, they prefer women's leadership, with confidence building, cooperation, and communication being what defines women's management style in the corporate in corporate analysis. And maybe this, in the crisis here, we should be able to push women forward into decision-making positions, not just advisory positions. It's a hope. It's not easy, but that's what we should be demanding.
Thank you, Frances and Asa. I think
Well, thank you. This is a huge question, and my colleagues already gave extensive answers. But I think, not least from my experience as a minister myself, there is a list of ways of involving, women if they're not around the table to start with, in almost whichever circumstance. If you want to have that checklist for yourself, this is how I'm going to go about to make sure that I have women's organizations, women's shelters organizations, trade unions representing women workers, women's small enterprises or big enterprises for that matter around the table, whatever it is. You can just do it, and you can do it quickly if you want to. I think also right now I am pretty worried, I have to say, about women in conflict zones or in women in areas, remote areas, perhaps in relation to capitals with armed groups or terrorist groups, which are very skilled at understanding how they can target women to destroy whole communities. And obviously then in those circumstances, you have to be very good at involving women. But nowadays, most organizations have to know this, and they have to know how to reach groups, local groups of women. And they have a lot of information and a lot of resilience to offer. So I think it's just a decision maker's task to know this. And if you haven't got that list as a decision maker, then just write it now. And I also think that something that my colleagues alluded to, which is a positive change, and that is that although we only have 5-6% women, either as heads of states or heads of governments, we have also more, we have them. There are more women among ministers of finance, ministers of foreign affairs, etc. And nowadays you can assume those positions and use them for your feminist work. 10 years ago only, a lot of women who were in those positions would not do that because they felt they were weakened if they were speaking about gender equality or feminism. Today, you can actually be elected using that because you use those arguments. So I think it's very important to hold those politicians accountable, of course, but also to support them and so that they can use that platform in relation to the tasks that they have. Also, the UN has a lot of convening power. We should use that the best way we can. And my final point is, I think also that women politicians and women in decision making, especially on the highest levels, they have been shot down so many times. They have been questioned, they have been ridiculed, they have met a lot of resistance. So they are excellent actually at using evidence before they go out there, because otherwise they are shut down. So I think this particular crisis, which requires a lot of knowledge, listening, inclusion, advice. That I think is good for a lot of women leaders because they are used to that. Otherwise they wouldn't have survived and not least gone to the places where they are. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for some very important points there on how to include the voices of women in these decision-making processes. Actually, Asa, we'll stay with you because there's a specific question to UN Women. And how do you reach out to the rural women of the world who are the majority and have no access to digital resources?
Yeah, thank you. That is a really excellent question. And we have some examples of doing that concretely in quite a broad program we have, for instance, in the Sahel in West Africa, where women live under the most difficult circumstances and where the armed conflicts are also often exacerbated. And we do have programs there to work together with women and their organizations for best use and introduction of smartphones, for instance, and to help women reach markets in a way that they would otherwise not do. This will, however, this is one example of what we're doing now. There is more, but this is an area that we have pointed out for future work for UN Women in relation to the generation equality, as we call it, which is the future gender equality agenda, which builds on the gaps that we see in the assessments of Beijing 25. We have 6 action areas, action coalitions, and the digital divide is one of them. So we are very aware, and we work together not least with UNICEF, with organizations, with the private sector to try to both understand, but most of all do something about this enormous injustice, especially in the poorest areas. So I'm happy to work together with whoever has knowledge or interest in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question, and you all touched upon it, domestic work and how usually it's underpaid, and particularly this was a question particularly from someone from Latin American countries that have been hit strongly by COVID-19. The question is more general about what we can do to either make sure domestic work is financially properly paid and that it's also spread, the burden is spread among men as well. So I know, Francis, you touched upon this. Maybe you can start with this one.
Yes, well, the decent work agenda of the International Labour Organization is a basis. And also there is the domestic work resolution. So there are bases in international law, but between the understanding that domestic work must be decent work, because it's necessary in 2 aspects. One, it's necessary to allow families, fathers and mothers and children of older parents to work and to be in economic markets. And secondly, it's necessary because the people who are carrying out the work are carrying out, as was said, I think very strongly by Asa Regnér and by Olga Algayerova. It's very responsible work. It is extremely responsible work, and it should be properly paid. And also, with the loss of jobs in the 3rd and 4th industrial revolutions, one of the things that is not so easy to do on the modem or to do with a robot is look after children or sick people. So it has to be one of the jobs of the future, which is more fully trained, more fully respected, more fully paid, and also the hours have to be shortened. This idea that one person can look after the person that they're caring for 24 hours and not get more than a minimum wage for it is totally unacceptable. One person cannot be on duty 24 hours, has to be limited hours of work like every other job. So we've got a long way to go in that, and that incidentally the Domestic Workers Convention left open. It didn't say that you must limit the hours of work of care, but you do have to limit, and states have to subsidize it. And coming back to what was just said by Asa Regnér about giving, extending access to internet and computers to poor communities. It is not only in the developing world, it's also in the developed world that the poor families that do not have access. And this should be clearly part of the $10 million package that we said should be more gender sensitive. It's good for children, and we heard from from UNICEF, from Henrietta Fore. That's essential. That's the future, and it's essential for women as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Olga, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Just very short. Yes, the question sounds about the domestic work that is underpaid. And the question is this the moment for having a disrupting thing? My answer is yes. And it was the moment before, it is much more now. And it's not only in Latin America, it's everywhere, just the ratios are maybe different, but yes, my answer is yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And as one final comment, if you'd like, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is care work and domestic work and so on, and the unequal share of that is a huge issue, obviously, and the injustice here hampers the injustice in unpaid work hampers the possibilities in paid work, obviously. So it exacerbates each other. And I think also an issue here to introduce is sustainable financing. And I think that countries should find their own way of organizing this. But I do think that the COVID crisis has shown us that you can't have short-term ad hoc solutions for long-term responsibilities for societies, whether it is taxes or whether it is some other kind of system of national funding for these services, to make them paid and to make them sustainable. It just has to be in place. Otherwise, women will end up in these impossible situations. And it is not fair, but it is also just not sustainable for future. A lot of countries, not only OECD countries, will luckily have more people living longer. And these can sometimes be enormous tasks for the person in charge of taking care of this person for many years, and very complicated issues. It's not sustainable to just look through your fingers and hope that women will just solve it while they do some kind of paid work as well, and maybe at the same time take care of small children. So it has to be a long-term investment, and it costs money, but it has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. I think time has come, but I want to thank you all for answering these questions and for being here. And I'm going to pass the microphone back to Chava.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for effectively drawing attention to the important points. And thank you to all the panelists, participants for asking the questions. It was very stimulating to all of us. I'll ask Professor Raday if she can take 1 minute and wrap up the session.
Well, what a tall order after such an enormously rich engagement. It was amazing. I'd like to make 4 points. One, Amina Mohammed, who pointed out that the COVID crisis exposes and exacerbates existing inequality for women and girls, and also points out that the way forward has to be through solidarity and sustainability. So we've got 4 concepts there that we have to keep in mind. And then to Henrietta Fore, who pointed out that you have to prepare girls not only to educate them, but to educate them for their economic capacity, so that their lives are going to be good lives. And that this is a shift in thinking, incidentally, over the last 20 years, that we understand education per se. You need education which is aimed to allow girls to be economically capable of sustaining themselves. And that includes education and skills. And the COVID crisis has brought forward the idea of long distance learning, but it has advantages and disadvantages, as we said, because of access of all members of community to computers and to the internet. And then we had Olga Algayerova, sorry, who talked about the situation, the economic situation in Europe. And she points out the threat that we're in a situation which may undermine decades of gender achievement of gender equality on the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, and that we need cooperation and partnership for a rapid economic response and a sustainable recovery. So she does, and coming from Europe, of course, it's high-income countries on the whole, and a very well-developed human rights system. And I'd like to join what those two speakers said, because one of the comments on on Henrietta Fore's presentation was we need not only economic sustainability for girls, but we need philosophy, history, and I want to add human rights education. We need human rights education. And I think that came out from those two, the responses of those two presentations. And lastly, to Asa Regnér and UN Women, who are pivotal really in the international fight for all regions. And as she pointed out that we cannot return to business as usual. So we have two stages. We need rapid response, and we need to rethink the future. And and she did point out that a checklist of what is gender sensitive policy must be put before all governments. But I do end with a note that I add for myself from my own presentation, that the implementation of all our ideas depends on getting women into positions of power. And even inviting women to the table requires leaders who have some gender sensitive awareness. And this is a barrier. And we need all of us together, as we said, with cooperation, but also with some fighting spirit to insist that the checklist of gender sensitive responses, both rapid response and long-term changes in an unequal infrastructure, get to the leaders of the world, and they are not going to be allowed to ignore them.
Thank you very, very much to Francis, to Olga, to Asa, and to Henrietta, who unfortunately had to leave. We really appreciate. We know it's not easy these days to make time, and we appreciate it very much. So thank you again very much. You're of course welcome to stay on for panel 2 or any other panel that you'd like to join. We will now take a 5-minute break. It is 5 minutes to 5. So please, anything you need to do it now. And at 5 o'clock, we come back on. 5 o'clock Jerusalem time, we'll be back. So please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Toda rabah. Thank you.
Thank you all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, MASHAV.
Thank
you.
Thank you.